Hey, Ashley.
Hey, Kelly.
Thanks so much for coming today. And I think it's going to be a great conversation because you've got so much expertise in this area of burnout. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective on what's going on. Um, might be helpful just to start off with tell us a little bit about you and what you do. So you're a GP who has special interest in psychological medicine, I guess, and you specialize in food, sex, and bodies. And so I'm really curious to sort of understand what made you focus on that and how did you get to where you are today and your interest in studying to be a doctor in the first place. So tell us a little bit about you.
Okay. Um, well, thank you for having me on and you know, giving me the opportunity to talk about this stuff with you. I'm sure we'll have a great time.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so um I should just say for the audience, from a perspective of being clear about labels, etc.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm a specialist in general practice with a special interest in psychological medicine, and I have further training around specific issues to do with food, sex, or bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
so we're not allowed to say we're specialized in an area that's,
Yeah. Yeah.
so it's very particular us as medical professionals how we get labeled.
Yeah. No, that makes so much sense.
Which is tricky sometimes.
Imagine.
Um, so how did I get here is a really interesting question, Kelly, because when I was younger, I wanted to do a media and communications degree at Melbourne Uni.
Wow.
That was my what I was aiming for when I was studying for my HSC.
Yeah.
And I had this sort of process where I went through being interested in journalism to marketing to copywriting. And I sort of got to a point where I was like, I don't really want to sell things to people as my job.
Yeah.
So as I was driving to a job that I had after I'd finished my HSC, I drove past the Toronto private hospital. I don't know if you know where Toronto is. It's in not in Canada, it's in Newcastle, like around
Yeah.
where Macquarie. And I thought, I'd like to go into healthcare. Maybe that's a place where I'm not going to be selling to people so much.
Yeah.
I can give something or help people in a different way. And I was MSNing with my brother. Do you remember MSN?
Yeah, I do. I do.
And he was studying at UNSW in Sydney, an engineering degree, and he was like, why don't you study medicine? Like, oh, that'd be too hard. I don't think I could do it. And he was like, oh, I reckon you could. Like, I've got friends who are in medicine, and I think it's easier than my some of the things in my engineering degree. And so I
Oh,
was like,
really?
well, that's what he was saying.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay. And so I applied to do medicine, and I figured it was easier to be in than, like, it's easier to get out than to get in. Um, which maybe is a little bit of a furphy actually, because it's quite hard existentially then to shift. But I figured I would just study, and if I didn't like it, then I'd do something else, or I'd work, and
Yeah.
if I didn't like it, I'd do something else. And I just really enjoyed it. I liked um, learning about the body. I liked understanding how things worked, and I particularly liked how it was much more practical. It wasn't so much around being on computers and writing essays, and
Um,
a lot of the assessment processes were practical assessments, verbal assessments, etc. So,
oh, okay.
and I liked being able to use my hands to, like, diagnose things. It was, sort of a very practical, human-based profession.
Uh-huh.
I didn't really know what I wanted to do within medicine. I couldn't really decide for a long time. And I liked sort of everything, but nothing enough to want to spend my whole life doing that one only system.
Mm.
And but I did get swept up a little bit into in what I call hospital fever. like it's sort of quite adrenaline focused, quite, you
Um,
know, I think the way that medicine is often practiced in hospitals, it's got a very it's very focused around the professionals as opposed to the patients. And so you can get a little bit swept up in that sort of atmosphere of um, the medicine and the emergencies that occur and what's going on. And it's not so much about the people that you're working with. It's more about what you're doing
is
as a
it sort of like an
practitioner.
adrenaline rush type thing? Like
Yeah.
the,
Yeah.
the thrill of solving a problem? Like we get a bit of a
Yeah.
dopamine rush with it, don't
Yeah,
we?
totally, totally. And, the focus when people do, or at least when I was a junior doctor, um, around ward rounds wasn't necessarily on chatting with the patient. It was about all the doctors talking to each other about the person,
Yeah.
and that's quite dehumanizing. So I think over time, my sense of morals and ethics started to come more to the forefront, and I realized that I did a community term in general practice, and I realized how different it was working with people who've aren't in a robe, so they have their clothes on and can choose to do whatever they want once they
Mm,
leave the room. Like, so there's a lot more autonomy and agency, and the power dynamic is very different in the community. And also the power dynamic's very different amongst doctors in community-based practice. It was much less hierarchical.
mm,
It was much more collaborative. There wasn't a sense of someone who'd been practicing for decades was better than someone who was new to practice. Everyone,
yeah.
very much the practice that I worked in, everyone respected where everyone else was at and knew that there was something for everybody to offer in terms of a team.
Yeah.
Um, and I really liked having a collaborative relationship with the people that I was working with, and it didn't
Yeah.
feel like I was having to, I noticed a stark difference between working with someone in community versus working not really with anyone at all in the
Yeah.
hospital. And I
Yeah.
had this moment, I went back and did one term in the hospital. It was my last rotation in my second year of hospital-based training. And it was a pediatric term, but I remember I have this image of walking up to the doors and the doors sliding open electronically, and I could feel like the buzz and like the hyper arousal of the actual system. Like, and it sort of
Yeah.
hit me as I walked through the door, and I was like, I can't keep working in this place. It's going to be too much for me, So the
Yeah.
difference in between a community-based practice and hospital-based practice, instead of it being this adrenaline rush that was quite addictive, it was more like, whoa, there's a lot going on here. And, the stark contrast between relationships and the way the system worked and relationships with patients was very, very
Mm,
noticeable. So
yeah.
that's what made me choose general practice.
Yeah.
And then I felt like I was led. They say your special interests, you don't choose your special interests choose you.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So
mean, I guess it's the same for any career in a way, isn't
yeah,
it?
totally. And so I, as a female GP, it's not uncommon to see a lot of people that have mental health issues,
Yeah.
and I seem to have an affinity for working with it. I liked working with complexity. I liked understanding the connection between the body and the brain.
Mhm.
And I ended up just accumulating a bunch of different qualifications to try and understand gaps in the system or fill gaps from where I was working. I work in a regional area, so there wasn't always people around who are working in those particular areas. So I ended
Yeah.
up doing further training in working with eating disorders, um, psychosexual therapy, and
Yeah.
then also somatic um,
Experience.
training. Yeah,
Yeah.
so somatic experiencing training, as well as a bunch of other things. It initially started as a bit of a personal journey for me, and then
Yeah.
I was like, oh, this is actually super helpful. How can I incorporate some of these things into my practice
Yeah.
and sort out trying to establish some qualifications to support, the sorts of areas that I wanted to work in. And then I was incorporating that into my regular general practice for many years. And I got to a point where I felt like I needed to have separate days doing longer consultations and then general practice time.
Yeah.
And then I realized the difference between when I walked up the stairs to go into my GP room versus when I was working on doing longer consultations in a bit more of that psychological medicine specific
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah.
And I would just feel so tired walking up the stairs.
Yeah.
And I remember holding a scalpel once and just being like, I don't want to be doing this anymore.
Yeah.
And so when, I decided to then go into working in my special interest area full time and open my own practice, and
Yeah.
that's where I am.
Wow. As you were talking and you were talking about pursuing the areas where you saw the gaps, but also you were interested in, that really resonated for me and maybe a
Mm,
lot of people. And I think I've probably done the same thing,
mm,
because
mm.
sometimes a uni course can't actually offer us the things that we want, can it? And so we have to go and find these different areas and then just sort of, synthesize all our knowledge and bring all our experience and our knowledge and our wisdom into it, don't we?
Well, yeah, and I think there's different ways of knowing and
Yeah,
different ways of experiencing, and some of those are very knowledge based and cerebral and cognitive, and some of those are much more body
body.
based, experiential, and existential, really.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And so tell us a little bit about burnout. That's what
Hmm.
we're here to talk about today, because
Yeah.
I'm very interested in it because it comes into my practice as well, particularly because I focus on that midlife area. So it's, and I think with I'll just use the word menstruality to cover our life from when we start our periods to when they end. I feel, and certainly this has been my experience, it's very easy to get to that very tired and burnt out place. We don't necessarily live in an environment that just supports us to be able to live it in that sort of cyclical, rhythmic way that our
Mm.
cycles want us to live by.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, such an interesting, query and question that you brought into the space around, what it would be like if we structured our society around a cyclical pattern as opposed to something that's the same every day and every
Yeah,
week. And if we talk about the period when we start bleeding, i.e., menarche, to the period where we stop bleeding, menopause, that's generally about 40 years
yeah,
of a life, which is that's a long time, right? And
long time.
and a lot of young women, most the age of menarche is roughly around 11, so there's a couple of years either side. It's getting younger each as society progresses.
Yeah,
Um, and the rough age of menopause is any time from 45 onwards, but often around 50.
yeah, 50.
Um, so 35 to 40 years is a common time for people to be bleeding, but it's often the time that women are then going into high school
Yeah,
and university and careers, and there's a certain structure, and it's none of it cyclical. So burnout.
what is
Is it
burnout?
Yeah, is it related to cycles? Um, well, burnout is interesting. It's not necessarily considered an illness or a disease, but it is a syndrome, and it has been
Yeah,
classified by the World Health Organization in 2019. I've got my little
okay.
notes here that I'm going to read off, but
Yeah, go for it.
so it's the summary is essentially, I'll read out the definition, but I'll also give a summary first because it's probably a bit easier, but it's a workplace issue.
Yeah,
So sometimes we can try and extrapolate burnout into other areas of life, and I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing because it's a helpful way to sometimes describe just that sense of overwhelm or too muchness.
yeah,
But specifically, according to the powers that be,
yes,
burnout is occupational, and the difference between burnout and other syndromes is once you remove from the occupation, then the burnout goes away, or the issues
yeah,
go away.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But essentially, it's characterized by three dimensions: energy depletion or exhaustion, mental distance from one's job, feelings of negativity or cynicism in relation to the job, and reduced professional efficacy.
yeah,
So it's very specific in the definition that it's from chronic workplace stress that's not been successfully managed.
yes,
And so it's this idea that the resources for someone to do their job are outweighed by their capacity to be able to do that. So they're basically under-resourced and overworked.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what we've started to understand about burnout is that if there's adequate resourcing, adequate peer support, and adequate remuneration, and the workplace is aligned with the people's values, there's less
Mm,
risk of burnout in those workplaces.
mm,
Um, but it is an interesting conversation to open up as to whether we should actually extrapolate, this chronic sense of exhaustion or energy depletion without the job related quantifiers to actual life, because it is something that when you look at particularly women in the workplace with
mm.
families, that's a tough job, having
So tough.
children, working, managing the home, the classic sort of we don't live in communities anymore. We live in more of a nuclear family structure.
Yeah,
Not all families are nuclear families, but there's still that sense of one family, one house, rather than
yeah,
multiple families in a multiple house.
yeah.
And there's less reliance on community members to help rear children. So essentially, when you look at the social cultural context of women who are working and having families, there is a lot of under resourcing, and
Like
you
massive.
know
And
and
because I worked in corporate for so long and was responsible for, leadership talent and gender diversity in different organizations. And just if you look at like just the data, like the drop off of women once they have kids, not coming back up, maybe after the second. Um, and the common feedback, I know I heard something different recently, but we all used to say we had to pretend like we didn't have kids, like we were expected to work and not kind of bring the kids into the workplace. And then I think it was on TikTok or Instagram. I was listening to some young, when I say young, say 30 something women talking recently. Must have been a clip from a podcast they were doing. And they said, um, we're expected, because we have so much more knowledge about mothering now, we're expected to be like this perfect mother who's highly attuned to our children and there all the time. And then we're expected to work like we don't have children. And so, you're essentially, so I don't think it's changed. Well, just from my experience, because my kids are young adult and very old teenager now, I don't think it's changed much in the last 20 or 30 years, but maybe we have more information about the nervous system and attachment theory and we understand it better. So maybe there's more expectation on them, is what I'm,
yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
know
I think
what they
that's
should be, the shoulds.
yeah, totally. I think in general, our society has sort of these unrelenting standards on what we should be able to achieve
Mm,
in all facets and domains of our lives. And I don't necessarily think that we're socioculturally set up to support that at all. Like
mm,
if we look at, well, what then supports mums to be able to be there, are highly attuned for their children's in the years that they need it, and be at work and be able to fully be present at work while also meet the requirements of home life. We're totally in a situation of under resourcing.
mm,
It's not the resources around families in general to be able to manage a lot of
mm,
that stress. And um, I think we do see that playing out in family systems. And previously, how we set up the 9 to 5 40-hour work week.
mm.
That was at an era where the common way that families were structured was that there was the man going to work and the woman rearing the children, and that
Yeah.
allowed
It's
there was a support.
150 years ago, do you
Yeah.
know?
And there
Like a
was a
lot's
support
changed.
structure. There was a support structure around that person being able to go to work, and there was sort of these shared um the idea was that there was this different roles were taken on in order for that to be able to happen.
Yeah.
And as society has developed and we're moving more towards equality of gender and opportunity, and we know that there's not the same equality in terms of home um
Of the
home chores,
of
distribution of, yeah,
home home chores, yeah.
yeah, home chores,
Well,
or
I mean, I
like,
think some like, there are some, I would say I feel like my husband's amazing,
yeah,
and there are definitely some, and I think there are a lot
definitely.
of men who really actively wanna be
Yeah,
involved in parenting,
absolutely.
but there are also
Absolutely.
some that are still quite
Well,
old-fashioned,
not even that, like,
traditional, whatever.
not even that,
Or their
like,
work doesn't let them do that.
yes. I think, when we talk about the population overall, we're looking at, means and averages and general
Mm,
trends. And I
mm,
think you rightly say, like, I don't necessarily think this is a gendered thing either, because, um, there are a lot of men who are, really contributing to trying to maintain
mm.
equality in their relationships. And then, but then there's the same issue for them as well, that
Of course,
there's not only
absolutely.
the 9 to 5, 40-hour work week, there's
Yeah,
also the stuff they need to do at home. And
yeah,
we are seeing significant rates of burnout in our culture.
yeah,
And we can really view that from lots of different lenses. Our, I guess, capitalist striving, constantly achieving, constantly, improving, constantly making more money
yeah,
is somewhat part of that. Or, the we actually live, in comparison to previous generations, in bigger houses with more affluence, more food
yeah,
availability, more
yeah,
financial stability, even though a lot of young people are struggling to buy their own houses. I think both of our parents were of that generation where their parents, it was quite lucky if you had a room for each child. It was
yeah,
the expectations on our living, standard of living has also gone up.
definitely, definitely, there's, well, I guess, we have this aspirational lifestyle that, social media brings,
Mm,
and so, that really taps on our sense of belonging, doesn't it? And wanting to sort of have a part of that. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there's a whole lot of other factors we could bring into this. There are a lot of women who are financially secure enough and stable enough who could live, as you say, cyclically, where their jobs adjust to where their menstrual cycle is at or where their energy levels are at. Um, and that's not um, a luxury that's afforded to people who are, living week to week or in the bottom line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think also I mean, I would say, because, I do executive coaching as well. And so I work with a lot of senior women, and their jobs have no space
Mm,
for anything. And, you know, I did a little talk last night on menopause around where I'm, going into my practice next year. And a couple were there who have really, really big jobs. And we were talking about it, and what they need to do to support themselves during that transition, and just the exhaustion of perimenopause and menopause. And in the ideal world, yeah, we would have time to rest more and, resource ourselves better, but
mm,
it's hard, right? When
totally.
y for a lot of us, and I think, I've seen a lot of women leave the corporate place and of work, and start their own businesses, and it's amazing, and they do really well. But as you and I know, running your own business takes a lot of time and
Yeah.
energy, right? So
And the resources are less.
the resources are less. You have to get smarter doing, like with your technology and using it better and all that sort of stuff. And so I always sort of come back to this culture that we live in that really, um, rewards and applauds busyness and striving,
Mm,
achieving. And
mm.
so I'm curious about your thoughts about that, and like, how do we support ourselves with the reality of what we live in?
It's hard, hey?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, if you think about it from a nervous system perspective, it's like our culture is stuck on. It's stuck in this sort of constant fight or flight state where we're, running and jumping and, um, there's this sort of um, there's this energy quality it's a bit like
Yeah, yeah,
me, and
yeah.
it's quite fast, um and that is actually, it can be quite fun, there's a whole bunch of, like we talked
For
about before,
sure.
adrenaline and dopamine, and I think it's easier to manage when you're young and your body's like
It's quite addictive when you're younger.
yeah, well,
No, I remember my consulting years in the big consulting firms. My God, it's so fun
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah,
crazy. Yeah.
yeah.
And
And
you're like,
then, but
yeah,
over time, like our bodies are not they're fallible, and they age and they rust out, and we can't, like, unlike a car, we can replace some things, but we can't replace everything.
yeah,
And you can't run a car without like, if you run a car on 140 kilometers an hour, it's going to run out of fuel quicker than if you're at 80, and
yes.
eventually you're going to have to fill up the tank. So I I there wasn't a consultation that I would have when I was working in regular general practice where I wouldn't be talking about the empty bucket,
Yes.
where you've got all the things that fill up the bucket as the tap that's going into the bucket, and then all of the things that drain the bucket on the other tap on the bottom. And
Yeah.
there's
Oh, it's a
just
good metaphor. Yeah.
there's just this constant draining of all of the water out of the bucket and very little going in to top the bucket up.
Yeah.
And it's difficult because we live in a society or where it's generally expected to not do the things to fill the bucket up. It's sort of seen as if you're busy and you're working hard, and you think about the phrases that exist in our culture, like, oh, have you been busy? Are you
Yeah, I
working
know.
are you
And it's
working hard?
like if you're
Oh,
busy,
that's
it's
good.
almost
That's
like I've
good.
noticed recently with people asking me if I'm busy. And when I say, oh no, I'm just kind of what's the word I use? I'm just bumping along, which is how I like it to be. You know, I feel like you don't go through a few years of somatic experiencing training like you and I have and not learn to be safe. But it's almost like if you're not busy, there's a lack of safety almost. Like
Well,
and
yeah, or the
it's like
expectation, like,
overcoupling of it almost. I'm like, oh, this feels a bit. And so when I say, oh, I'm just bumping along, they're like, but is that good? I'm like, yeah, because I've got time to rest and I've got time to go to the movies if I want to go to a movie and just, go for a swim or do my exercise and spend time with Cam. And, that's what I want at this stage in life. I don't want to be running around like a crazy
but
person.
isn't that interesting? Because you go, I'm bumping along, which is how I like it, and the questions back are like, oh, is that what you want? How do you like it? And it's almost like there's this justification that needs to come from stepping out
Correct.
of the social norm of busy,
Out of
hardworking being
control.
good. And if you're not busy or you're not working hard, then you're lazy or it's bad.
Yeah. I actually had I mean, I have a few clients who are in a similar scenario like you and so I always share they're like, what did you do? Because I don't work full time. I work sort of 3.5 days over 4 days basically. And for a reason, and as you know, I've had cancer. So I made a promise to myself a few years back that I would stop overdoing it.
Mm.
And so it's a non-negotiable for me. But interestingly, these people I've been working with, they're like, like what did you yesterday? Oh, I just nicked down. I had a couple of hours and it's cheap movie day on Tuesday. And I just wanted to see this movie. So in between clients, I just nicked down and watched the movie. I see how you do this. I see,
Mm.
like, it's like, oh, this is interesting. Like, yeah, well, you can do it too, especially if you work for yourself, you can make those
Arrange your schedule.
choices. Yeah, yeah. And then a few of my old corporate friends who like to catch up with them and, what have you been up to? And then I'm like, oh, I like this way that you're living your life. I'm like, well, I feel like it's important for me, given my story, to follow that path.
Mm.
Very easy for me to overdo it. No effort at all, quite frankly. So, yeah,
Yes, and there is a particular, personality slash, nervous system type that, is,
Oh, thrives on
is
it.
yeah, thrives on it. And um, the overdoing is quite easy to do because there's a certain level of productivity that can come with that, and also reward that can come with that. And
Yeah,
um, there's there's a lot of value in our society placed on achievement. And
so much. And when you get rewarded for it, it feels good, doesn't it?
totally, totally, yeah. And and then you got to think, well, what am I sacrificing? And you've
Yeah.
sort of talked
What's
to
the
some of
cost?
those. Yeah, what are
Yeah.
those costs? And in some ways, it can be, you go from being advised in 140 k's an hour to stalling, and then the car's, the engine's blown up, and the car's on the side of the road, and you're in the middle of nowhere, and you've got to try and figure out how to fill up your tank again, but your whole engine needs an overhaul, and you need to figure out a different way of driving and fuel efficiency. And
Yeah, you've got to take a different road, like almost like get off the freeway and go on the back road, you know?
yeah, which can
Mm.
be lonely, hey?
Yeah,
If you're
super lonely.
or like when you're doing something against the trend, if you're doing something different, there's a lot of resistance to the difference.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. Although I feel like now, um, I think because the freelancer lifestyle is quite common now.
Mm.
Uh, and I remember talking about this in the workplace 20 years ago because I was, doing a lot of strategy and futures stuff, and like this will happen, and people were like, no, 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 don't be ridiculous. And then it was here before we knew it. And so I think in some ways, people, it's great because it gives you a bit more agency and choice over how you work and how you choose to engage. Um, and the thing that I think is super appealing if I was in my 20s and 30s is depending on the type of work that you do, but certainly if you work in tech, you can be anywhere if you're coding and doing stuff like that, right? You don't have to be in the office space. So there's something very appealing about, being able to work from different parts of the world and just be a freelancer and do your work. But there comes, there's a whole other side
Yeah,
of running your business that's challenging with that. But anyway, we're not here to discuss that.
totally. And there's something about what you need to do to get to that point as well. Like,
Right.
I think um, I look back on the last 20 years, and in order for me to be doing what I do now, it would have been very hard for me not to do what I've done over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Um, I personally didn't get to a point of burnout, but I was acutely aware of it in the medical space when I was a trainee GP, and I was going through IVF, and I was just,
Okay.
sort of trying to fit in hormone cycles,
Yeah.
like egg collections, embryo transfers, failed embryo transfers or miscarriages, procedures, at the same time as still maintaining my professional life and income and social life. And I really became aware of what it's like to be struggling with one's own stuff when you're working with someone else struggling with their own stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And um, so it was that sort of when I started getting into a lot more of looking into doctors' health and well-being, and was interested in burnout and could see it just was rampant. And, everyone sort of thinks that, or I had this sort of realization that so many people in in professional positions are dealing with some really significant stuff
Yeah.
outside of the workplace. Like you said yourself, you went through a cancer journey,
Yeah.
and um, so there's something, around, it's not even just about supporting mothering, but how do we support people to, like,
Mhm.
in their lives in
Mhm.
workplaces?
Mhm.
Because um, I think when I started noticing that, that's when I started doing things a little bit differently from the beginning. I started finishing earlier, or starting later, or I'd
Mm,
put more breaks in my day, see less people
mm,
per hour. I would take time to settle myself in between each consultation, and
mm.
then started running workshops for other GPs in tandem with, or I started running workshops under the banner of RACGP, where I was in a position where we were, as a team, building workshops around how do we support doctors in the industry
Mm,
to
mm.
build skills. And I think the biggest learning that I had from working in that space was how much it's actually a systemic problem rather than the individual solutions,
Oh,
you know?
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and, to go into bat and be the person that's driving the systemic change is also a really, really hard,
It's
job to be in.
yeah, I mean, any really complex issue
Has
where
complex solutions.
it's a multi-pronged solution, right? It has to be.
Yeah.
Mm, um, yeah, and so many of um, the big health issues and challenges that we face in society are, as are, the big kind of economic and environmental, and they're super complex. And
Mm,
I go around and teach executives how to think more systemically and how to deal with complexity and all this sort of stuff.
mm,
It's really, really hard. Um, and it's
yeah.
dynamic, right? Like as soon as you make an intervention, like immediately, the moment you make a decision or you stop and pause, it's changed again. And it's this kind of emergent and
Yeah.
all changing environment. And so even dealing with that is exhausting.
Totally,
So,
totally.
so it's
Well, it's culture change, which
it
is
is
it's a
culture
tough
change.
gig.
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember
Absolutely.
I remember this one time I was like an intern, and this was my first year out of medical school. I was probably towards the end of my intern year, and or in the middle somewhere. I was quite comfortable with working. Like
Yeah.
I wasn't feeling flustered, and I remember calling one of the nurses who was looking after one of the patients that I needed support with, to ask for them to help me or do something for the patient. And they answered the phone, and I was like, "Oh, hey, it's Dr. Ash. I'm just calling about this patient." They were like, "I'm on morning tea." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And they were like, "You'll have to find me at another time." And I'm like, "What?" And because, the culture at the time was like, we didn't have morning tea as doctors. We weren't having morning tea. We weren't having lunch breaks. We weren't going to the toilet. Like,
Yeah.
we weren't doing anything of our normal bodily functions. And so, like, my first response was like this real anger, like, how dare you? Like, I didn't say this, but internally I'm going, how dare you have like morning tea when I have to be looking at, like, being here looking after the patient? Rah, rah, rah. And then I was like, oh, hang on. That's just a really clear boundary.
Yeah.
That person's gone, I'm on a break. Like,
Talk
come
to you
find
when
me
I'm
when I'm
ready.
not on my break anymore.
Yeah.
And but the override culture of the medical system is that you don't actually do that. And the cool thing about nurses having a union is that they have this entitlement to like protected breaks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank
And
God.
protected meal
Thank God
times.
they have
Yes,
that.
of course, of course. And it's
Yeah.
it's excellent. And so I was like, oh, hang on. I wonder if I could do that.
Yeah.
Because, like, who is saying that I'm not allowed to have a lunch break, or I'm not allowed to go to the toilet? Like, who said I can't do those things? It's the
I
external
know what you mean.
expectation.
It's
Yeah.
nuts. I remember once when I was at ANZ having like back-to-back meetings all day, and I got to like 1 o'clock and I thought, if I don't go to the toilet, I'm going to wet my pants right
Yeah.
now. I was starving, I was hungry, I had a headache from just being sitting talking to people, and
And not
I
eating or drinking,
and not
and
eating.
yeah.
And I remember saying to my assistant at the time, like, oh my God, please don't do this in my diary. I can't bear it anymore. I need like a break. You need to put 20 minutes in there so I can go to the toilet, eat something, walk, get some fresh air, or do something. Like it's unhealthy.
Totally, totally.
Yeah.
And So I did a little bit of an experiment, and I was like, what if next time I get called and I'm on lunch, I say I'm on lunch? And so next time I got called and I was on lunch, hey, Dr. Ash, we need you to do this. And it wasn't a medical emergency. Of course, if it was a medical emergency, then,
Yeah.
that trumps my lunch. But it wasn't a medical. And I went, you know what? I'm actually on my lunch break now. Like, I'll come round in an hour and sort it out, or whatever the time period was that I was allowed for
Yeah.
lunch. I think it was like 30 minutes. um, and they're like, okay. I was like, what? Like, oh my gosh, I can set a boundary here. I can say, actually, I need a lunch break.
How
And
was that? How did that feel? I mean, obviously you were giggly, so it must have felt really good.
well, like there's probably an element of it feeling a bit naughty, because the expectation in the medical industry, at least from my perspective, is that, like, you don't do that. If you need to go and do something, you go and do something. You don't go, actually, no, I'm having a break. Um, so it felt a little bit like, that I was being defying the external pressures of the culture.
Mm, mm,
But it felt really nice that actually, like, someone on the other end of the phone respected that. Like,
mm.
it's really hard to set boundaries when someone doesn't respect them, and it makes it a
Oh,
lot easier to like hold it, like to set a boundary when someone realizes that's what it is and they respect
yeah,
it. And
yeah,
um, I think early on in my career, I realized that if I didn't set clear boundaries and hold them for myself, that no one else was going to do it for me. Particularly
yeah,
particularly in general practice, where the standard is 4 patients an hour. And so, you're seeing somewhere between roughly about 30 patients a day, which is a
yeah.
lot.
Nuts.
Yeah, it's a
It's
lot of
nuts.
nervous systems. It's
Yeah,
nuts. And um, in between all of that, you're getting phone calls from the nurses in the treatment room, you're getting messages from the admin staff saying that people are ringing up requesting scripts or referrals, or they
yeah,
need an urgent appointment and there's no space. Where can I put them? And
yeah,
or this person needs to be seen today. And the more that you say yes to all of the extras, the worse that you're able to manage the actual day in front of you. So I
yeah,
realized, if I didn't start to say no, there would just be this expectation that it could be done. Like, if I was saying yes, then I'd be double booked consistently.
yeah. Like
But
Ashley can do
if I can,
backflips, so we'll give her
yeah.
triple backflips to do.
Yeah, like, oh, well, she's fine with fit-ins, or she's fine with script requests, like, in between people, or she's fine with X, Y, and Z. So we're just going to do it. We're not going to ask anymore. It's just going to
Yeah,
happen. So
yeah,
I realized, and was lucky to have a lot of mentors who also taught this to me. But if you don't set the way that you want to practice, or the way that you want to work up from the beginning, then it'll be set by the external factors outside of you. So you need to be
yeah,
really clear about how you want to work, and how that will come through, and delegate appropriately, and say no when it's actually an unreasonable request, rather
yeah,
than feeling like, your boundaries are slowly closing in, and then you sort of feel like you're about to combust, because you're trying to manage or trying to meet everybody else's expectations of what it is that you should be able to provide for them.
yeah.
And I think
Great,
that's one
great
of the
mentoring advice, right? Like great mentoring.
yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things that we can do as individuals in a systemic problem, is realize that um, even though there's external expectations, there's under resourcing, there's systemic factors, that if we don't understand what our yeses and nos are, then it's going to be really
Yes,
hard
yeah,
to be able to say yes and no. And if we keep saying yes when we really should say no, then we're just perpetuating the problem.
yeah. I agree. I agree. Like limits and boundaries, right? So important. And what does a yes feel like, and what does a no feel like inside of us?
Totally. And
And
then,
what is it? What
the
and a maybe, because often I find a maybe is
yes,
no. For
yes.
me. And I just,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I just there's a bit of doubt as to whether it's I'm second guessing myself, I think, and I need to sit with it a bit. But 90% of the time, I go back and say no.
And I agree, personally, if there's an unsure, or maybe it's I want to say no, but there's some sort of fear, or there's some sort of unwillingness to upset somebody else or put them out, or
Yes.
So it's I want to say no, but I feel like I can't say no because of all these other factors. And it's then really helpful to go, what am I scared about here? What am I worried about here?
Yeah.
Who is this a me thing? Is this a them thing? How can I communicate? If I'm worried about how they're going to take it, how can I communicate effectively so that my no is heard, but it's also I'm being empathetic towards the other person. Um, but also being clear, because sometimes if you give a maybe-ish no, then it's taken as the potential for that it could be flexible and malleable. And,
Yes. Yes.
then maybe if they ask in a different way or try and, you know, work around the excuses, then it'll go from a no to a yes.
Yeah.
Um, there's
Yeah. And I
difference
think
between
sometimes,
negotiation and compromise.
yeah, I totally agree with you. And even, I find sometimes just for example, asking people if they're interested in doing a podcast with me, and where I think it might be a little, maybe I'm stretching the topic a bit. And I always say, if it doesn't feel in alignment for you, that's totally fine. Um, and maybe I'm wanting to offer them a bit of an out, but um, I want to give people space to be able to have choice.
Well, I think once you do, I mean, in our somatic experiencing practitioner training over the course of 3 years, like boundaries is a foundational
Yeah,
thing that we work on. And I don't think at any point in the whole of that program, any of the sessions that I was in, there wasn't some element of boundary stuff in there, and
yeah,
I think as you become more aware of the importance of holding your own integrity around your um, physical as in being the body, psychological space, as well as energetic space, i.e. the space around you.
yeah.
Um, Once you really value that, holding that as an integral piece, and that it's a really important thing both for the person and for other people around clarity and clearness in relation to it, I think you're more willing and open to the boundaries of other people. Like when other people say no, you go, okay. Or other people
Fine.
say yes, you go, excellent. And when they say, I'm not sure, I think someone who's well boundaried will pick up on that and go, hang on, is that a yes or is it a no? It's not
Yeah,
quite clear there for me. And
yeah.
um, I think it would be really interesting to know what it's like for well boundaried leaders to lead organizations that support the boundaries of people working within it.
That's a very good point, and something that I think about a lot, because I feel that, particularly in those very, very large organizations, and I'm talking places that have, upwards of 10 to 20,000 employees, there's a lot of what people have to let go of themselves to be able to function.
Yes, totally.
And so they get to the end of their time there and they have, a lot of imposter syndrome stuff going on because it's their alter ego has led the success, not the real them.
Yeah, the
So
part
a
of
lot
them
of
that
them are
needed to
like,
achieve, and
yeah, and
yeah.
they get to midlife and they're like, oh my God, I just can't do this anymore. And they need to take a break or want to do something different or whatever. And also those jobs, like they're 24/7. And so there's no boundaries whatsoever. Right. And just,
Does the right to disconnect occur? Is that exist in Victoria as well? Is that an
yes.
Australia
Yeah,
wide?
it's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
new
yeah.
thing. Yeah, it's quite,
How cool is that?
I'm very happy with it. I'm very, very happy with it. And, I was like, because I remember, when before I left when my kids were little because I just found it impossible to just, I was working for someone who had no boundaries whatsoever in my last job and would just contact me at all times. And I just would stop. I would block, not answer the phone basically, or just say, I'll get to it tomorrow. So I had to be very, very boundaried with them. And that didn't go down very well because, of course, they had no boundaries. So they would just,
Well, totally. If someone
didn't
doesn't
like
have,
it.
if there's not an internal understanding or a conceptual understanding of boundaries, or there's an expectation of boundarylessness, then if someone who doesn't have or hasn't developed as good a boundaries as someone who has, there can often be like this, whoa, I don't well, there can be this sort of, oh my gosh, well, that's quite, I don't understand. I know, like, I don't understand what it
Yeah,
means
yeah,
to
yeah.
have that person going, actually, that doesn't work for me. And, it's a really interesting piece that I've noticed a lot, particularly in workplace cultures, around this expectation
Yes.
of, you know, the that, well, that's just how it is. So you just need to,
Get on with it. You just got to do it.
yeah,
It's like
suck it up, pull your
literally that's how it
pull your
is.
socks up, pull your boots
Get on
on,
the bus
and
or get off and leave. Like literally, I used to hear that conversation that a lot of people had all the time. Or you go home at 6. Actually, I remember one, this HR director that we had who came, who wasn't an Aussie and sort of was new to the country and the culture, and that's completely fine. Didn't have kids and was like, why are all the people on your floor leaving at 5? And I'm like, well, because they have children and they're in childcare. And if you are 1 minute late for picking up your kids from childcare, you get charged $10. So for every minute you're late, you get charged $10. So if you're 10 minutes late, that's $100. Cost you $100 to put them in there. So you're going to, oh. And I said, instead of looking at time, look at productivity, like look at their output,
no,
because I
totally.
look at the part-timers that work for me. I'm a part-timer. There's more output that you will get from those people in 3 or 4 days than you will get from someone working full-time, I guarantee you, because they're not wasting time going for coffees. And I'm not saying coffee is wasting time, but they just don't have time for it because it's good, often good networking, talking, and communication. But they just get in there and they don't muck about.
So I'm no organizational expert, but my understanding is that the data would support that as well, that actually a shorter work week leads to slightly increased productivity as opposed to
Yeah,
a longer work week. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. So
Yeah.
how can we, talking about all of this, like how can we better resource ourselves? What are some of the things that we can do to resource ourselves to support um, burnout? And I'm thinking of the mums and dads, and I'm thinking of ladies in perimenopause whose body is going through this enormous change, and they probably going to need more rest. And it's, we always laugh with my clients, like it's totally okay for teenagers who are going through an enormous change to need more rest. And but we're not for people in midlife who are going through perimenopause, who have got a career, who might be supporting elderly parents, who are trying to make their marriage or their relationships work. We have such high expectations that we can do everything. And it's almost like we feel that there's something wrong with us, that we need more rest. And so,
Mm,
I'm always like, well, your endocrine system's a deep system. It's a very deep system in your body. And when it's going through massive transformation, it will need more time and more rest. What do you think is helpful in terms of how we resource that, but also, maybe talking about it as a complex issue? I mean, the government did a Senate inquiry at the end of last year into menopause that the Green Party led. This was in Australia, if you're listening from overseas. And I wrote a submission for that because I deal with a lot of people who are struggling during perimenopause, or particularly with their mental health, or having old trauma come up. And my big thing was like, God, we need public awareness around this. We need more education for doctors around the physical, but also the mental and social and cultural aspects of it. I'm just curious about what you think of, given though, motherhood or parenthood and then this, how do you feel we could support ourselves better and resource ourselves better? And how might we, this is a tough question I'm asking you, how do we deal with the cultural overlays? Like, I'm just interested in your
mm,
reflections because
yeah,
you
yeah,
have
yeah.
good insights.
Well, thank you in advance for assuming I'll have good insights before I talk about it. Um, look, complex issues require complex solutions.
Mm,
And as a as my primary training in general practice, the way that I lens things is I see the body as a whole system. You
Mm,
know, that there's not just one organ system that has priority over the others. They all work in synergy. Um, and that whole body system is in the context of its environment. So the environment being um, the family, the workplace, and the wider community at large, as well as the actual natural environment, you know.
mm,
And um, my personal belief is that the issues that we're seeing around support for people going through changes at different parts of their life,
mm,
whether that be from illness, sickness, or injury, or a transition such as menopause or parenthood or
mm,
pregnancy,
mm.
um, or deaths in the family, those sorts of things,
Yeah,
and
divorce. Yeah.
divorce. Let's not leave out, you know,
Right.
there's significant things that happen for men at different stages of life as well.
Yes.
Like there's different developmental stages that occur
Yes.
psychologically.
Yeah.
So, you know, my personal view is that the way that we've set up our culture is leading to the degradation of the natural environment.
Yeah.
Um, it's making us unwell and sick as humans. It's making the other animals on this planet die out and become extinct. And you know, it's I think we're really at this massive crossroads of, are we willing to change the way that we see how we should live our lives in order for the generations that come after us, or the world that comes after us. So I think from a complexity perspective, there's a lot of sort of existential questions in here as well.
Yeah. But I
Um,
think you're right to mention them. Like I agree with what you're saying.
but there are, you know, I'm a bit of I would call myself a reformed change maker. In that I prefer to do change a bit differently than from how I used to do before, which was sort of harder and faster and quickly, and
Yeah.
a bit more around focusing on what it is that are like, if we drill it down to what can we do as individuals amongst this complex system, I would say the first thing to look at is, you know, what is important to you in your life and what will make you be able to live your life in a way that feels like it's supportive, rich, and has integrity.
Mm,
And what is it that are your unique gifts and strengths that you can bring in order to shift whatever needs to be shifted for you to do that for yourself and the people around you, you know, because
mm,
if we say things like, oh, well, this needs widespread systemic change, and um it sort of puts the onus on other people to do that. And I
mm.
think a lot of the people that um you work with, or who might be listening to this, are the people who are going, actually, you know, I am the they. You know, if you're talking about
Exactly.
widespread system changes,
And I don't have
I
the
am the
capacity
they.
to be the they.
Yeah. Is so I think we need to shift a little bit more from an individualist approach to collaborative, but we as
Yeah.
individuals also need to be, I think, really clear on what are our boundaries, what are our yeses, what are our nos, what is important to us, and how can we share our gifts in a way that's not extractive but supportive and encourages movement towards the kind of world we want to live in and the lives that we want to live in. And
Yeah.
that may require doing things very, very differently to how they've been done before. You
Yeah.
know, but the thing that happens is when lots of people want to do things differently and do things differently, stuff does change. You know, that's how we've
That's
um that's
exactly right.
how that's how women were able to vote and enter into the workplaces, and our Indigenous Australians were then recognised as actual citizens and allowed to vote as well,
Yeah.
and then
And
recognised as landowners,
to
or you know,
your
the
point,
people.
they did it because people collaborated
Yes.
and came together and worked together and supported each other. And you cannot solve complex issues without collaboration. It is not possible.
No, and I think to have effective collaboration and to
Hard.
not burn out in the process of trying to make systemic change, you need really healthy boundaries.
Yeah, you're right.
And you need really healthy boundaries, and I think you need to know how to be aware of where your nervous system is at when you're in a fight flight, whether when you're
Mm,
regulated, when you're in a shutdown collapse, and how do you get from one state to the other.
mm,
And there's so many complex factors that go into that. And um there are lifestyle things that will impact on the nervous system as well. But
mm,
I think, being really clear about how you want, what's important to you and how you want to live your life, and what are you saying yes to, what are you saying no to, actually helps you to be able to then create space for the things that are important to you and can support your health and well-being, as well as nervous system regulation, and reduce the risk of burnout.
fantastic. That is a great answer. Good place to finish the conversation, I think,
Oh,
too.
thanks, Kelly.
I think that'll be the quote for the clip.
What's
Um,
that?
no, your last, as you were talking, I'm like, oh, I'm going to record that. And I'm going to thank you so much for today and all your insight and wisdom. And I just love the way you think about everything so holistically. Um,
It's really hard, Kelly. It's just
it is hard. It
yeah,
is
no, what I
hard.
mean is, like, we're often looking for simple solutions, and we can start in a simple way, and then over time it'll make more sense
Yeah.
looking at the complexity.
I mean, I always think, yeah, simple your own boundaries, right? But I mean, that's so hard. You and I both know that's so hard in terms of getting to that. But it's a good place to
Yeah.
start, right? For
Yeah.
a lot of people,
Boundaries.
about like
I
your own
mean, it just leads to
limits
so
and
much.
boundaries. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm.
How can people find you on social media, and tell us your website and all that sort of stuff?
Okay. Um, so my website is Dr.
Yeah.
Ashlea Broomfield, Ashlea, and then like sipping a broom with a
Yeah.
field.com.au.
Yeah.
My handles, I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Um, my handles on Instagram and Facebook are slightly different now. On Instagram, I'm the Vitality Doctor.
That's right. I'll put that in the show notes. But yeah, but they
Okay.
can
Yeah,
find
yeah.
you on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Ash has really great posts. So if you're listening and you're interested, her posts are always good if you want to follow.
Yeah, I think it's sort of important to note that the way that I structure my posts is I've sort of looked at what I think are the five pillars of a life that's filled with vitality. And so my posts are centered around those five pillars, in there'll be
Mm,
different themes over the course of a 12-month or 2-year period.
mm,
Yeah.
brilliant.
Mm.
Thanks.